Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating aspect of Islamic practice. The idea that there are specific times when acts of worship, like prayer and fasting, are actually discouraged or even forbidden.
It sounds a little strange, right? I mean, if prayer is a pillar of the faith, how could it possibly be wrong to do it? Well, that question is exactly what we're going to explore today, and it reveals a much deeper layer of discipline and intention within Islamic law.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll get a handle on a key legal term, makruh. Then we'll pinpoint the exact times prayer is off-limits and dig into the wisdom behind that. We'll also navigate the exceptions, and finally, we'll see how all this applies to fasting too.
All right, first things first. To really grasp why certain acts of worship are sometimes discouraged, we absolutely have to understand this Islamic legal concept of makruh. It's not as simple as something being just right or wrong. So, makruh literally means disliked or detested. The best way to think about it is as a category of actions that are better to avoid. You're not necessarily committing a sin if you do them, but, and this is key, you are rewarded for choosing not to. It's all about refining your practice and going beyond just the bare minimum.
And what's really crucial here is that makruh isn't just one thing. It exists on a spectrum. On one end, you have makruh tahrimi, which is so strongly disliked it's basically knocking on the door of being forbidden. Then, on the other end, there's makruh tanzihi, which is a much milder dislike for things that are, better to avoid but are closer to being permissible. This difference between almost forbidden and simply better to avoid is going to be super important for everything else we talk about.
Okay, so let's see how this concept applies directly to our daily prayers. Because yes, there are very specific, well-defined windows of time when offering a prayer is prohibited.
In total, Islamic law points to 5 key periods during the day when certain prayers are considered makruh. And these are broken down into 3 major times with the strictest rules and 2 minor times that have more specific restrictions.
These 3 are the big ones. The first is right as the sun is rising, for about 15 minutes. The second is a super brief window, maybe just a couple of minutes, when the sun is at its absolute highest point at noon. And the third is during the 20-minute or so period when the sun is setting. Praying during any of these times is generally considered makruh tahrimi, so almost forbidden.
Then you have the 2 minor periods. The first is the time between when you've prayed the dawn prayer, fajr, and the actual sunrise. The second is after you've prayed the afternoon prayer, asr, all the way until the sun starts to set. Now, in these cases, the prohibition is specifically against voluntary prayers, and it falls under makruh tanzihi, that lesser but still important level of dislike.
So, the big question is, why? Why do these prohibitions even exist? Well, this isn't about arbitrary clock watching. There's actually a profound spiritual and historical wisdom behind pausing our worship at these exact moments.
So the number one reason is this. The prohibition was set up to create a very clear, unmistakable line between monotheistic worship of the one God and the practices of ancient pagan groups who literally worship the sun. By deliberately not praying at these key solar moments, Muslims are making a powerful statement that their worship is for God alone. It's an act of pure submission, really, trusting that divine wisdom structures even the timing of your devotion.
And this just brilliantly illustrates the spiritual side of it. A very famous prophetic tradition, a hadith, explains that the sun rises and sets between the 2 horns of Satan. Now, this is metaphorical language, of course, but it emphasizes that these times are associated with negative spiritual forces, and believers are guided to avoid prayer then as a kind of spiritual protection.
Now, like many things in Islamic law, these rules are not 100% rigid. There are really important exceptions and nuances, which shows just how flexible the tradition can be when it comes to real-life circumstances.
And these exceptions really show a lot of that flexibility. For example, while you can't offer make-up prayers during the major times of sunrise or sunset, you can offer them after the dawn or afternoon prayers. An urgent funeral prayer, that can be performed at any time. And, crucially, if you're running late, you are still allowed to perform the afternoon asr prayer even as the sun is setting, although it's disliked to delay it that much on purpose.
And here is a really cool point of scholarly difference. What about in the holiest city, Mecca? Well, the Shafi school of thought actually argues that there are no prohibited times for prayer in Mecca, and they base this on a hadith encouraging worship there at any hour. But the Hanafi school holds that the general prohibition is universal and it applies even in Mecca. This is just a great example of the healthy diversity of legal interpretation you find within Islam.
And I want to make something crystal clear.
The prohibition is only on the formal ritual prayer that we call salah. Other forms of worship, like the remembrance of God or dhikr and making personal supplication dua, those are not only allowed but are actually highly encouraged during these times. The connection to God is never, ever cut off.
All right, so this logic of prohibiting worship at certain times isn't just for prayer. It also extends to another core pillar of Islam, fasting. Just like there are times you shouldn't pray, there are also days when it's actually forbidden to fast.
There are 5 specific days of the year when fasting is considered near forbidden, that makruh tarimi category. You've got the day of Eid al-Fitr and then Eid al-Adha, plus the 3 days that follow it. Why? Because these are all designated as days of eating, of celebrating, of feasting. Fasting on the so-called Day of Doubt right before Ramadan is also forbidden, just to avoid any confusion about when the holy month officially starts.
And beyond those forbidden days, there are other types of fasts that are just generally disliked, falling into that makruh tanziyah zone. This includes things like continuous fasting for days on end without ever breaking it. Also, perpetual year-round fasting is discouraged if it makes you physically weak. And finally, singling out a Saturday or a Sunday to fast is disliked if the reason is to specifically honor those days, because that could start to look like the practices of other faiths. So, let's just quickly recap the big takeaways here. First, all of these rules are ultimately there to protect the purity of worshiping one God. Second, when it comes to prayer, the times around sunrise, high noon, and sunset are the most restricted. Third, there are always exceptions for urgent situations like funerals. And fourth, for fasting, remember those 5 festival days around Eid and the start of Ramadan are strictly off limits.
And all this brings us to our final thought. These rules about when not to worship might seem, on the surface, like just a bunch of restrictions. But maybe a better way to look at them is as a form of spiritual discipline, something that teaches believers that true submission isn't just about doing the acts, but about doing them with the right intention, at the right time, and for the right reasons. Definitely something worth reflecting on. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.